Let's begin with Professor Stiglitz. So your book has been recently translated into Chinese under the title 美国真相, The Truth About America. So I wonder, what do you consider to be the most significant piece of truth that was previously hidden or misunderstood and now exposed with this book? Professor Stiglitz.
I think the surprising thing, you might say, uncovered in the book is the extent to which the United States market economy is marked by exploitation, by market power, with corporate power exploiting consumers, a lack of bargaining power of workers. So corporations are exploiting workers. The ability to exploit the vulnerabilities of individuals. And so the theme of the book is that what is needed is a new social contract, a new balance between the market, the state, civil society, where government needs to play an important role in regulation and investment. But democracy is extraordinarily important, but it has been undermined in recent decades. And we see the attempts at voter suppression. And I actually try to describe what is going on. How is it that you could have in a country professedly supporting democracy, having a majority rule over the majority, a minority rule over the majority without attention to their rights? So a vast majority of Americans want gun control, want higher minimum wages, want access to health care, a whole set of reforms, and we can't get it. And when I say a majority, 2 to 1, 3 to 1, and the problem is a minority of, you might say, exploiters, corporate, others who are engaged in exploitation, know that their agenda is not supported by the majority. So they have been engaged in a process of disenfranchisement, which includes voter suppression, disempowerment, which includes gerrymandering, and putting democracy in chains, which is using the Supreme Court to restrict what can be done and to give more power to money in the political process.
Well, thank you, Professor Stiglitz. And Professor Zhang, we also often hear saying that China's success since the late 70s, since the beginning of reform and opening up, is due to the state retreating to give room to private sector entrepreneurs, allowing them to prosper in a market economy. Do you agree with that? And what do you think China has done right vis-a-vis the United States?
From my study of international political systems and institutions, I come to a conclusion that for an ideal, well-functioning society, it's necessary to have a balance of 3 powers, political power, social power, and capital power, power of the capital, in the interest of the vast majority of the people rather than minority of people. The problem is, or my concern is, perhaps the power of capital is way too strong. It has somehow dominates or captures the social power and the political power. So when you advocate rightly in your book for stronger democracy, for more checks and balances, Yet, if this check and balance between administrative jurisdiction and legislation, well, if all the three branches, political branches, are captured by the power of capital, then what will happen?
One of the central tenets of the book is that a system of checks and balances can't work if there are too large inequalities in society. So I'm basically agreeing with you. When there are too many inequalities in income and wealth in society, in one way or another, those who have disproportionate wealth will get control of the levers of society and dominate. So that is the limitation. You can have the organizational structure in the political system of checks and balances, but they will be overridden by the influence of wealth. And that's one of the reasons why I call for limiting the inequalities of wealth as a central issue. Now, the hardest question is, given the levels of inequality present in the United States, how are you going to limit the perpetuation of those inequalities? And here's where democracy may make a difference, and we'll see. The point is that we still, in principle, have one person, one vote. The influence of money, one of my earlier books I said, has resulted in sometimes America seeming like $1, one vote. But in the legal framework is still one person, one vote. And what we are seeing right now in the United States is an outpouring of Democratic support for Vice President Biden. The level of engagement, the sense that America's at a turning point. It is authoritarian. We have one person, Trump, being an authoritarian figure, trying to divide the country, and we have another person, Biden, trying to bring us together, a person who's very deeply committed to democratic values. And especially among the young people who often are not engaged in politics, the extent of their engagement is phenomenal, but it's across the board. I hope the check on all of these abuses that I described a minute ago.
I can see most American people care about gun control, care about health care, care about medical insurance, etc. Yet it's always difficult to reach consensus for all kinds of reasons. The right wing, Donald Trump, individualism, this kind of government is a necessary evil or whatever, bad thing. In the case of China, thankfully, we have a tradition from ancient time, Confucianism. It's always what we call people's livelihood oriented. Whatever you do, political reform, economic reform, social reform, all should end up in improving people's livelihood in a tangible way, both material and now even spiritual and other aspects. So what we have is what we call the consultative democracy, from the people, to the people, one round. And to the people, from people, another round. And from people to the people again, another round. At this stage, we're producing this next 5-year plan. It takes, literally thousands of rounds of consultations at all levels of Chinese institutions and societies. It's like a kind of supply to produce demand, So I wonder whether, despite the fact that, as you suggested in your book, so much support, whether for Biden or for his democratic ideas, for more equality, for gun control, yet it's difficult to reach consensus and then build on consensus and move the nation forward. this is a challenge.
Let me say, I agree. The problem is not reaching, you never in any society reach unanimity. The question is, do you reach a large enough group of people that you can go forward? And the problem has really been money in American politics, I believe, because I think there is a consensus in America on most of the major issues. There are very vocal voices on the other side, but there's a broad consensus. I think the hardest issue, though, is openness to criticism of government policies. I think one of the strengths of the United States is that I can very openly criticize President Trump, and many other Americans have joined in that criticism. And were it not for the fact that we have a very free press, he would have suppressed information about how bad he's doing, suppressed information about the pandemic. So one of the strengths that we have is so far our free media, our ability to criticize everybody, including the president, and to call him a liar, because he is a liar. But I mean, in many other countries around the world, if you were to say as publicly as so many people have said to the president that you are a liar, that you distorted the truth, you'd wind up in prison. One of the strengths of the United States is that we've so far been able to maintain that kind of openness, that critical element. Because if you don't have that critical element, you can get consensus, but it can be behind the wrong policies.
May I just jump in with a question? Just now, Professor Stiglitz, you mentioned the critical factor, the importance of openness to criticism, the importance of being able to criticize the government. What if Trump got re-elected? What will happen to the American system? Because it seems to me that the system is so entrenched, meritocracy is so entrenched, that it protects and prolongs the kind of neoliberal capitalism. So what if America fails to incrementally or progressively renew itself? So we all know it's unsustainable, but what will happen after that? Will it implode or into an even bigger crisis with probably negative implications for world peace? What will happen?
So first, let me say, I feel fairly confident that in a couple weeks' time, it will be very clear that a large majority of Americans will have chosen to go in the direction of democracy and in the direction of Biden. Many of us are asking precisely the question that you're asking. What are the consequences, the dire consequences of another term of Trump? And quite honestly, we don't know. Partly it depends on the outcome in the Senate and the House of Representatives. So this is where the checks and balances do come in, but I'm afraid it's more likely to lead to gridlock. What that means is two things. It means that America will not be able to address some of the major problems. And that means the discontent that is very apparent will grow. And it will undermine the ability of America to respond to the challenges of that we face. The other problem that it poses is that Trump is an authoritarian figure. He doesn't understand and incorporate in his mindset very strong democratic values. And he likes to use executive orders, likes to ignore norms and even laws. Fortunately, he has packed the judiciary, so the judiciary isn't performing its functions that it should. So quite frankly, I'm worried. But let me begin and repeat what I said. I have a lot of faith in the end in America, and I do believe that we Americans will make the right decision, and that we view as this nightmare will be over on January 5th.
Well, that's a very long nightmare. What about Professor Zhang? What do you think of the outcome of the US election? What if Biden wins or Trump get re-elected? What will happen, especially to what are the policy implications in terms of China-US relations? Please.
Well, first, on the part of this election, from the sources we have collected, Biden leads in opinion surveys and in some areas, but it seems there's still a strong counterforce. So we'll see very soon. And I sensed a very strong sense of optimism in your book, which I like, which is part of Professor Stigliz's style. I like it. And you often refer to the progressive movement and the New Deal and the Great Society. So all these are historical precedents where the United States engage in meaningful reform and overcome its challenges. But compared with these three historical precedents, you see today's United States, as you have elaborated in your book, you have even much stronger monetized politics, money-oriented democracy. And also this rise of the new social media, to a great extent also controlled by the power of capital. And the society is more divided. It used to be at that time more driven by the middle class, rising middle class. Now it's somehow divided society. It's about identity politics. And then all of this need strong and competent visionary leaders. I wonder whether you see this kind of leadership in the near future. For China-US relations, I indeed hope that we will overcome at this particular stage. In the White House, you have some Cold Warrior. I think it's very stupid. You cannot contain a country like China, which has over 130 countries as its largest trading partners. And you have the world's largest middle class, 400 million people, real middle class with properties. And world's largest trading nation. You cannot contain this kind of country. So this is my basic message. I think, when Biden spoke about 4 major challenges for the United States, the pandemic, the unprecedented recession, and also climate change and racial divide. I think, except the racial divide, we cannot do much about it. For the rest 3, pandemic, recession, and climate change, United States needs China's help, and China is also ready to help. I think, hopefully, whoever in power after November or January will have much better US-China relations. It's not only for our 2 countries, but also for mankind.
Professor Zhang, you mentioned that the next, because America certainly faces a crisis, and the man that leads America out of the crisis, navigates America out of the crisis, will have to be a very strong leader. And my question is Biden such a strong leader for the future of America?
I'm not very sure. From whatever I can read, he's not that a strong character. But who knows, maybe when he becomes a leader, he can show his particular side, which we do not know. He can be a strong leader, or his team can be strong. And so let's hope for the best. That's for the American own interest. I think even Donald Trump, perhaps, I don't know whether Professor is agree or not. Actually, he has identified some problems like the over-influence of Wall Street, whatever he mentioned about his vested interests. But his prescriptions are totally wrong. That's my feeling. I don't know whether Professor agrees or not. He saw some problems, but the prescription he gave not working. It makes things worse. Society more divided. The new leader in the United States should become not only strong, but also indeed visionary with a long-term vision. That's my critique of the Western political system. You cannot somehow produce now leader with long vision. It's very short-term, short-sighted, and populist. That's a trend. It's a pity. So I think that's a part of the political reform the United States must engage in. And you could have a lot of participation, a lot of voices on the streets. But in political science jargon, we call this participation without influence or without much influence, which cannot in the end reshape the decision making. So that's the key message. Yeah.
Right.
So I think actually, as you were saying, there are many things that make for a good leader. Building consensus. And Biden will, I think, be extraordinarily good over that, especially after a president who's been very divisive, bringing the country together. I think he will do an extraordinary job in that. What makes for a good leader is having a good team. What is very impressive right now in the Democratic Party across the country is strong leadership. Governors, people in the House of Representatives, in the Senate. There is a host of strong personalities, but strong leaders in every respect, with expertise, with a command of the complexity of the issues that we face today, with experience. So I'm again very hopeful that obviously you don't know who's going to be a Franklin Roosevelt until after the thing is over. But each period of time calls for a different kind of leader, and we will inevitably need to go through a healing process. And I'm hopeful that Biden will be the kind of leader that the country needs at this particular moment.
Could I raise another point, a question discussed with Professor Stiglitz? You mentioned the rule of law in the United States, which is a tremendous asset of US political system. Now, the point is whether there is a kind of what I call excessive legalism or rigidification of the legal system. For instance, when you want to, do well with this gun control, maybe you have to somehow amend this Second Amendment, revise this amendment. So it's a constitutional revision. But again, how difficult it will be, to revise the Constitution. It calls for a 2/3 majority of the congressmen, and then, I don't know, 3/4 of all the states. So it seems almost impossible given the divided nature of American politics. So if the legal framework cannot be touched, then, how can you push for these reforms on the current existing rule of law?
So one of the answers to that many people in the country are now supporting, it's not unanimity, it's not yet a consensus, but moving towards it, is the Constitution does not specify the number of justices in the Supreme Court. And there's a growing sense that there will have to be an increase in the number. You don't have to, the Second Amendment on the right to bear arms did not have the current interpretation until maybe 100 years ago. I don't know when the dividing critical decision was, but you could read that particular amendment in a very different way, which I think nobody in their right mind, I think, believes that it gives you the right to carry an AK-47 around. You can say, what was the original intent? It wouldn't be original intent because nobody carried those guns. They hadn't been invented. So the idea that you could ask, what was the original intent of a group of people, many of whom were slave owners, who, before the Industrial Revolution, what their intent was should guide us in the 21st century is an absurd notion and is a fiction. I think most Americans today believe those words should have been read in a very different way. So again, I think Trump has made us understand the limitations of our constitutions, the importance of norms as well as laws, and the fragility of our system. And having seen how much damage one person can do with a compliant Senate, I think there is a strong sentiment to make democratic reforms that will not that will make this less likely to happen again.
Just a quick sort of half comment, half question. Because in your book, Professor Stiglitz, in the second part is a sort of a prescription for the future orientation of the United States, but it seems rather, I mean, it's shorter than the diagnosis part. My concern is the consensus, the current consensus about the future direction, or the current consensus is about no more Trump?
So obviously, there's a lot more consensus about getting rid of Trump than there is about
no more Trump. Yeah,
detail. I think there's a broad consensus about the need for political reform, about ending the power of money. That's doing something about the Citizens United, doing something about gerrymandering. Most Americans agree about gun control. Now, on a lot of the things that make a big difference from day-to-day life, like healthcare, access to healthcare, broad consensus needs to be done. But there is a consensus that is a first step. And whether after that first step is taken, you need to go another step, we'll see. So you think about this as a evolutionary process. If it doesn't work, we'll have to take bigger measures. Again, everybody agrees on the principle that everybody should have access to higher education according to his ability, regardless of the income and wealth of his parents. He shouldn't have to get into debt by $30,000 or $50,000 to get a quality education. It's outrageous. So what I try to do in that second part of the book is lay out what I would call the common agenda. My purpose in there was to say, look, if people talk about a divided America, it's not divided. We actually share a lot of values together. And if we can see that common purpose and say, okay, now let's focus on what we agree on and say, let's begin on that journey.
As you know, both Chinese culture and American culture love certain slogans. And in the Chinese successful reform over the past 2 decades, there are two famous slogans. Yeah, one is seeking truth from facts. And that's about how to ascertain truth. And the other is emancipation of the mind. And so we're open to all new ideas, great experiences, whatever. And Professor Stiglitz, you are one of the few leading scholars who really try to assess Chinese experience and China's success objectively, and try to see whatever aspects which other country may refer to or even borrow, which I think is very open-minded. I hope, the American society will be more open-minded to Chinese experience, some of which, could be more relevant from my point of view to the United States than Scandinavian countries, which you refer to frequently, which are too small. I think you need scale and then massive experiment, and then the success of this experience can be more applicable to other countries. Yeah.
We'll move on to the next subtopic, which is globalization, the crisis facing globalization. After decades of economic globalization, we have become, at least China and the United States, have become so tightly and almost intrinsically bound with each other. So I have one question, is that we know that the benefits of globalization have gone disproportionately to the rich and powerful. And since they are the ones that have been tremendously benefited from globalization, why should they support those political forces advocating for decoupling? Well, if they don't support those forces, then how could decoupling effort ever be successful?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think what has happened in the United States is that the corporate interests that were very much behind the globalization as it occurred beginning in 1980 have become disillusioned with the way things have turned out. And I think they've gotten disillusioned partly because they thought there was a gold mine in China. They thought that huge market of $1.3 billion, 3 billion people, was going to generate huge amounts of profits. And it's turned out to be not so. And they've gotten a lot of profits, but those profits have declined. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is wages in China have gone up. And so it's not the source of cheap labor that it was before. And that's why they're going to other countries where labor is cheaper. So they've learned how to outsource, but China is not viewed as the goal in that way, the source of profits as it was before. Secondly, some of the American corporations made profits out of ignoring environmental and other standards. And China now is being much better at those environmental standards. And so they're looking for other places where they can abuse environmental standards. Hopefully they won't find any, but that's the third is that China has been very successful in developing its own companies. I've been driving a Volvo, which is owned by a Chinese company. So, the reality is that China has made enormous progress, and competition inside of China from Chinese companies is very intense. So the direct answer to your question is the corporate agenda for linkage has been very strongly weakened. And they complain a lot about the theft of intellectual property or restrictions on expansion in certain markets. But I think the underlying complaint is really, it's not been the source of profits that it once was hoped to be.
And as we all agree, perhaps, China is one of the few major beneficiaries of the globalization. Even today, most Chinese support globalization. From my point of view, US corporations have also, on the whole, benefited a lot from globalization. But I think due to what you have mentioned in your book, the political system, political institutional issues, gridlocks, whatever, somehow the interests have not been fairly distributed, at least part of it is redistributed across American society for the ordinary people. That's why a lot of people have grievances against globalization. And I was wondering, at this time, there is this tech war, trade war between China and States. We saw this restriction on Huawei and on TikTok, Ants, whatever group. And I wonder whether there is also this, what I call extension of what you have described, power, economic power, US corporations, supported by US government, vis-a-vis the Chinese companies. I think there's an element of that. They're afraid of what we call the free and fair competition.
Well, I think clearly companies have always turned to governments for help. The joke is they believe in competition, but in other sectors, not their own. Or for other people. I think same thing. I always noticed businessmen were always against subsidies, except in their own sector. So free market is something that applies to other people, but not to myself. Every company always says, well, I'm in a special circumstance where I need assistance, protection, competition will be destructive, unfair. So that's the nature. You just have to get used to it. And that's the reality. But public policy should be very much not to allow large corporations to use the power of government to advance their interests. That's not what government is supposed to be doing. I think that there still is a need for multilateralism. Economists have made a strong argument that the real benefits of trade are global. Regional trade agreements don't resolve that. In fact, you can get what my colleague Jagdish Bhagwati refers to as spaghetti bowl of complications of overlapping trade agreements with different provisions. To me, I think the biggest challenge is the following. After the collapse of the Iron Curtain, the end of the Cold War officially, Francis Fukuyama wrote this very influential book called The End of History. And it was sort of a Pollyannish fantasy that we would all wind up as liberal democracies and free market economies. And one of the arguments for trade liberalization was that it would hurry on the day of that end of history where everybody was a liberal democracy and a free market economy. That fantasy, nobody believes in that anymore. We're not converging to the same political and economic systems. We are likely to have going forward different parts of the world working on different systems. That has very important implications because the rules of the game are easier to write if everybody's the same economic system. But when there are different economic systems, writing what might be called fair, reasonable rules of the game are really difficult. So the challenge is going to be, once you recognize that trade is not going to be necessarily leading to this convergence, and there's going to be different political and economic systems, how do we take advantage of the gains to trade, and how do we organize a world where we have to cooperate on climate change, on pandemics, on global prosperity and assistance to poor countries? So many areas we have to cooperate. How do we get that cooperation and at the same time recognize we will be arguing for very different economic and political systems? We will be, in that sense, I don't want to say competitors, but there are very different visions that we will be putting forward for the direction of society. We don't have to lecture each other, but we have different views. And the question is, how in that kind of world do we live peacefully together, cooperating in the many areas that we have to cooperate if we're going to succeed in living a prosperous life without conflict and within our planetary boundaries.
And having heard this very open-minded, thought-provoking statement from Professor Stiglitz, I think ideally, Professor Stiglitz, you will become the US president. That will bring so much welfare benefit for the mankind. And come back to Chris' question concerning globalization. I agree that there will be certain readjustment for understandable reasons. And regionalization will become stronger. Perhaps there will be a kind of European integration, Asian integration, North American integration. And there are new elements because China now is, by purchasing power, already the largest economy, and with 130 countries as its largest trading partner. China is advocating what we call a kind of new type of globalization based on a key message is what's called the discussing together, building together, and benefiting together, as characterized by this BRI initiative, Belt and Road Initiative, which is large scale. I hope really it's open to all countries. It's a platform, at this moment, the world's largest platform for a new type of globalization based on mutual benefit. And maybe eventually US will join in, at least US companies, some of them have already joined in, European companies are joining. But this is a grand project. We need some grand projects for mankind. Hopefully most countries will benefit from it.